Chapter 3 of Peggy's Trial by Mary Knight Potter. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Cora May's Trouble. Toward the end of the feast, Peggy noticed that Cora May seemed very silent. Even Ted couldn't make her laugh. Finally, when the rest began to play I Spy, Peggy found her sitting by the playhouse under the trees. She had a most forlorn expression on her face as she sat there digging holes in the ground with a stick. Peggy stood looking at her anxiously. "Is anything the matter?" she asked. Cora had paid no attention to her except to dig holes faster than ever. "You know I'm going home to-morrow," she said, "and I was thinking what a nice time I'd had here, and how lovely Miss Barton is, and she swallowed bravely. "And I wish I was you, Peggy, so I could stay here all the time." "Oh, dear!" Peggy tried to give the conversation a lighter tone. "You wouldn't like it at all to be me. You wouldn't have such lovely curls, and you'd have big feet instead of those little teeny things you dance on just like a butterfly." Cora May smiled as Peggy meant she should, but the corners of her mouth dropped immediately afterward. "Curls pull like everything getting combed and make me cry," she objected. "And your feet aren't big, and you're lots smarter'n I am, and Dr. Clayton is your father." "But you have a father, too," said Peggy. "You showed me his picture, and I think he's just elegant looking." "Maybe he is," answered Cora May unenthusiastically, "but I haven't seen him since I was a little bit of a girl when he left me with Grandmother after Mother died. And now," her voice dropped and she looked around apprehensively, "and now he's coming home with a stepmother. And I hate her. I hate her. I know I shall hate her." She burst into tears and buried her golden head in Peggy's lap. Peggy didn't know at all what to do, but sat and rubbed the curls all up and down the wrong way till there wasn't a hair untangled. Peggy had read about wicked stepmothers in fairy tales more than once. Still, she had a doubt as to whether they were always true descriptions. Anyway, it was necessary to comfort Cora May somehow. "But perhaps she'll be nice," she suggested timidly. "Perhaps she'll be better than a grandmother." Peggy's only grandmother was her father's mother. She was very deaf and very lame, and always very much troubled by any childish pranks. But Cora May looked up indignantly. "My grandmother is just beautiful," she said. "It was she told me they'd take me away from her. And I know stepmother will tell father I am horrid and he won't like me at all." The big tears rolled down her face in streams. "Oh, dear!" cried Peggy in deepest distress. "Is a stepmother so bad?" Then suddenly her face lighted up and she took Cora May's hand and patted it. "Don't you worry one bit more," she said with tremendous relief in her tones. "I'll tell you what to do. If your stepmother treats you mean, just you write a letter to father. He always looks after little girls, and he'll come right up and take you away and give you back to your grandmother." Peggy had heard from more than one grateful patient that Dr. Clayton could do anything. Cora May's aunt, too, whom she had been visiting, often said that Dr. Clayton was the only man she would always trust. Cora May was therefore quite sure he could save her from her stepmother if he chose. Now that Peggy promised he should choose, she began to feel that she might go home with less terror. A few minutes after, the doctor himself came out to the orchard. Seeing the traces of tears still on Cora's face, he picked her up and put her on his shoulder. "Well, Lady Bird," he said, "are we in the lovely October weather, or is it cold, rainy November?" Cora May didn't quite understand, but Peggy knew her father's ways. "Daddy." She slipped her hand confidingly into his. Daddy was the name with which she always cajoled him. "If Cora May's ever in great trouble, you'll get her out, won't you?" Dr. Clayton looked at the little special pleader with a twinkle in his eye. "If Cora May," he answered, at the same time holding that young lady straight up in the air and shaking his head at her forlorn face. "If Cora May needs me and there isn't anyone else to help her, I'll pack my grip for the next train and be there to right her wrongs as fast as steam can take me." "There!" said Peggy, beaming. "Now, Cora, you see, when Daddy says he'll do a thing, the biggest ogre you ever heard of can't stop him." Dr. Clayton laughed. "Some people call that obstinacy, Peg. I'm glad you see it's only a proper defiance of ogres." "Nurse," said Peggy that night as she was undressing, "are stepmothers always horrid?" Nurse was just then having too bad a time with Ted to answer. He had run downstairs in his pajamas and brought up Peggy's big hoop. With this clasped in both hands, he was shouting at the top of his lungs and making flying circus leaps in and out of the nursery and up and down the hall. Twice Nurse had caught him and put him back to bed to no purpose. Each time before she could hide the hoop, he had scrambled out and jerked it away. Dr. Clayton had given strict orders that all whippings were to be left to him. He was not at home, and the nurse was consequently at her wits' end. "Ted," she cried angrily as she caught him once more and shook him pretty severely, "I shall report this to your father, and he won't let you drive with him to Scranton tomorrow." That sobered Ted a little. "You're a mean, cross thing," he grumbled, drawing the bedclothes sulkily over his shoulders. "You don't think anybody ought to have any fun. I'm just glad you weren't here this afternoon. Miss Barton is 1,000,000,000 times nicer than you. She's got some sense." And he flopped over disgustedly onto the other side. Now Nurse in some ways was not very wise, but she had done the best she knew during the 6 years since Mrs. Clayton's death. It hurt her feelings greatly, therefore, to be so little appreciated by the children she really loved. It was partly because of this feeling that, when Peggy repeated her question, she answered as she did. "Stepmothers horrid!" she sniffed. "I guess you'd find out they were if you had one. You wouldn't be able to bamboozle her as you do me now, I tell you. I never knew one yet that didn't hate her husband's children. Generally she succeeds in making him hate them too. I guess you'd wish you had your poor tormented nurse back." Peggy's heart sank as she thought of Cora May. Then her invincible faith in her father's powers returned, and she went to sleep, sure that he would take care of her little friend. Chapter 4 of Peggy's Trial by Mary Knight Potter. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The New Pupil. A short time after this, the doctor told Peggy that he had just heard that Cora May's father and new mother had decided to stay abroad till Christmas. That meant that Cora was to be left at her grandmother's for at least 3 months more. Something that wasn't going to happen for 3 long months seemed to Peggy too far ahead to worry about. Besides, just now she had more than enough matters of her own to think about. In the first place, Miss Edith Barton was going to leave town within a few days for a long visit. Peggy consequently spent most of her out-of-school time haunting that lady's house. The fact that her own lessons were often therefore very insufficiently prepared was to her mind of slight matter. That she might also occasionally be in Miss Barton's way never once occurred to her. And Miss Barton, in spite of letters and errands and packing, never hinted to her little admirer that she would be glad of more uninterrupted time. Meanwhile, in her absorption, Peggy never noticed the excitement that was spreading among her classmates. "Peggy, come here," called Lena Brooks the morning after Miss Barton's departure. "Don't you think it's a mean shame, too?" "What's a mean shame?" asked Peggy, joining the group at the foot of the stairs. "Why, about that Baker girl coming to our school." "Who's the Baker girl?" puzzled Peggy. "And why shouldn't she come to school?" "Where have you been the last week?" exclaimed Hattie Harner. "Haven't you seen that curly-headed beggar Miss Shepherd put into our class?" Peggy's face was still a blank. "Goodness gracious! Lena's tone was scornful. "If I were you, I wouldn't be so wrapped up in Miss Barton that I didn't know if I was living or not. The Baker girl," she went on explaining, "is that little dowdy who's got Jane Miller's old seat." "Oh!" Peggy comprehended at last. "I remember now that Miss Sheppard did give a new girl that place. She had awfully pretty black curls, too. What's the matter with her, anyway?" "Matter?" sneered Brownie Campbell, whose father owned the big cotton mills and was supposed to be the richest man in town. "There's matter enough. She and her mother have just come from nobody knows where, and they have taken that hovel at the end of Walworth's pasture." "'Tisn't a hovel," said Peggy indignantly. "It's a very good little house. I heard father say so only last week." Brownie Campbell and Peggy Clayton never did agree. Peggy said Brownie put on airs because her father had a lot of money. Brownie, for her part, didn't see why Peggy should be so stuck up just because her father was a doctor. "Never mind whether it's a hovel or not," put in Lena Brooks impatiently. "They are as poor as last year's potatoes, and nobody knows who they are. And Mother saw Mrs. Baker hanging out washing, and I think it's a shame to put a washerwoman's daughter into our class. Why didn't she go to the Cheswick school with the mill people's children?" "Sh!" said Annie Rice. "There she comes." Peggy turned and gazed curiously. The others pretended to be much occupied with their companions and not to see the tiny, dark girl just entering the door. Her big brown eyes flashed one timid look at the knot of girls whispering and laughing together. A deep flush spread over her cheeks. With a little defiant toss of her black curls, she went upstairs without another glance. "What's she in black for?" asked Peggy as she disappeared. Nobody knew, and just then the session bell rang and they all hurried to their classes. "You watch the airs she puts on when she answers a question somebody misses," whispered Annie Rice as she and Peggy took their seats together. That morning Peggy had plenty of chance for watching. She had got so far behind in her lessons that she failed in pretty nearly everything. It so happened that the newcomer was called upon to correct many of her mistakes. Peggy was never the most brilliant scholar in her class. She was generally too much interested in things outside to give enough time to her studies, but such total failure as she made today was entirely unusual. It was especially exasperating to have this washerwoman's daughter prove herself so much better a student. At the first recess, Lena seized Peggy's arm excitedly. "There now," she cried. "Did you see how the little beggar gloated at your mistakes?" Peggy was cross and sore over her errors, but she made an effort to be fair. "Well," she said, "of course there wasn't any reason she should pretend not to know the answers when she did." "Maybe not." Lena looked as if there was some question even about that. "But she needn't have laughed fit to kill herself when you said a third of 20 was 7 1/4, need she?" "Did she do that?" Peggy's cheeks flushed angrily. "Yes, she did, and she's watching all the time to show everybody how much she knows." "Why doesn't she go into a higher class if she's so learned?" asked Peggy, with all the sarcasm her 10 years could supply. It was a new experience for her, Dr. Clayton's daughter, to be laughed at. She no longer felt in the least like taking sides with black-eyed, black-robed Elsie Baker. "Girls," she called out a few minutes later, "let's go chestnutting this afternoon. There are some loaded trees up near Halton's Brook." "But isn't that right near his field where he's got that ugly cow?" Annie Rice would have been afraid of a pet lamb if it was not securely tied. The rest of the girls hooted. "Supposing the field is near," said Brownie Campbell. "Cows don't waltz over stone walls, do they? We'll see you don't get eaten up," she added derisively. None of them paid any attention to the little black-robed figure sitting disconsolately alone on the window sill. Peggy had suggested the excursion because she knew Elsie must feel that she was purposely left out. The others never even once thought of her. "I suppose," she said to Lena as they started with their baskets that afternoon, "I suppose Miss Barton would say we ought to treat her better. But I'm not going to be laughed at without doing a thing back, so now." Peggy's conscience was not quite at ease about the matter. "Well," said Lena, "I heard Mother say that Mrs. Chisholm called on Mrs. Baker the other day to see if she'd like to take in some washing. She did it out of kindness 'cause she thought it might help her out. And she behaved awfully to Mrs. Chisholm. She couldn't have put on more airs if she'd been living in the biggest house in town. Mother said after that she couldn't expect to be treated well or her daughter either." Such a person, Peggy decided severely, didn't deserve consideration, and she wasted no more thoughts on the neglected Elsie. The chestnuts were so thick that they had their baskets full in no time. As they started slowly for home, Peggy announced her intention of going by the way of Halton's field. "It will bring me out nearer the store," she explained, "and I've got to get some pencils for tomorrow." "But that ugly cow's there!" exclaimed Annie Rice in terror. "I don't think she is," said Peggy. "I'm pretty sure Mr. Halton has shut her up in his barn. And anyway, I can keep along by the stone wall on this side and not cross over till I get to the next field." None of the rest wanted to go that way, and so she finally started out alone. "Be sure to keep this side of the wall if the cow's there," called Lena after her. "And you'd better take off that red cape, too, if you see her," added Annie Rice. "She hates red, they say, as much as a mad bull." Peggy wasn't afraid of any kind of an animal, or of anything else, her father often thought with a proud chuckle. To tell the truth, she was somewhat vain of her own courage, so now she waved her red cape fearlessly. To herself she said that she wouldn't be such a "'fraid cat" as Annie Rice for all the world. End of chapter 4.